Hello, children of God. Today we are talking about reverence for human life, one of the fundamental principles of Catholic social teaching. Some would say maybe perhaps the most fundamental principle of Catholic social teaching. We talked about it a lot during the social justice unit, and we're doing a whole unit on it right now. So it gets into a lot of the hot button issues that we talk about, and some are very political and some are very personal. And anyway, we're getting to it right now. So what you will need for this, you'll need notes one handout here, and you'll need the PowerPoint is here. Looks like this. So let's jump into it. So you can see we have that represents capital punishment. You have an elderly person here, or perhaps a disabled person here. You can see a relation to people in poverty, and then a child in the womb. So these are just a few of some of the issues that happen to do with reverence for life. So a lot each unit um, this semester is named after a virtue. So chastity, justice. This one is reverence for human life. And for a while, I was calling it respect for human life, but I think reverence, the idea that you would revere something, it's like another level up from respect. It's not just that you respect it, but you honor it in some way. You almost like protect it, hold it as sacred in some way. So it's not just a respect for human life, but a reverence for human life. So although I think I still have the title up here as respect for human life. Anyway, moving on. So this is a great quote here by Pope John Paul II. It says, "The quality of a society and a civilization is measured by the respect shown to the weakest of its members." Now, in 1981, he declared that year for the church the International Year of Disabled Persons, meaning all year we're going to focus on praying for and working for and just kind of listening to and raising awareness of plight of the disabled person. Sometimes popes will do this. I don't know if you remember a few years ago. Pope Francis had the Year of Mercy, and so we're supposed to, meditate on mercy. So, and there was a Year of the Family, I think, under Pope Benedict. But anyway, so you can apply this to any issue, but he was specifically talking about it in terms of disabled people. So, the Catholic Church believes in the dignity and sanctity of all human life. And basically, what that means is that if you are alive and you are human, that you are worthy of protection and you are valuable in God's eyes and should be valuable in our lives. And it doesn't matter what else you have to contribute or not contribute, no matter what you've done or haven't done, your life is still sacred to God, and so for us as well. So the church says that human life must be protected both socially, meaning like as a culture we respect it, but also legally. So it's not just enough to have a respect in the culture, but you need to have laws that actually respect it. And it's not just enough to have a law. You could have a law saying no slavery, but still have human trafficking thriving in the society. So it needs both of those. You need the societal side and the legal side to protect human life, is what the church says. So, and this is the church often talks about creating a culture of life, a culture of life. So again, not just changing the laws, but creating a culture from the ground up that respects and protects life. So we establish laws that protect the rights of all people. So the divine law basis for church teaching, this comes straight from the book of Genesis. This is kind of the foundation of everything we've talked about this year. The humans are made in God's image, the imago Dei, the image of God, Genesis 1:27. So therefore, every life is sacred and precious. And God has a vocation for every person. He calls everybody to himself, to be holy, to be a saint, to live with him forever in heaven as part of the everlasting kingdom of God. Some Bible quotes here. One of the most tattooed Bible verses in all of history, Jeremiah 29:11. "I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope in a future." This is from Luke 12. "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies, yet not one of them is forgotten by God? Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." Do not be afraid. God is looking out for you. He knows all the hairs on your head, and he's counted each one. So God knows us even before we're born. So prenatal, meaning before, before natal, meaning birth, nativity is like birth. So prenatal life is sacred. It says in Jeremiah 1:5, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I dedicated you." And Psalm 139 says, Lord, you formed me in my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Your eyes saw me unformed. In your book are all written down. My days were shaped before one came to be. So the Bible talks about how even unborn life is sacred to God. So therefore, our lives are not our own just to do with as we wish. They are a gift from God. And so while we do have free will, we do have an obligation to follow God's commands. This is from 1 Corinthians. It says, do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? You have been purchased at a price, Jesus. Therefore, glorify God in your body. So we have a responsibility to live a certain way. So we are not to take the lives of others as punishment if it can at all be avoided, or for any reason it can be avoided. Chapter to the Romans, do not repay anyone for evil. If possible on your part, live at peace with all. Do not look for revenge, but leave room for the wrath of God, meaning we don't have to take care of that, God will. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. So it's not God, it's not our job to to kill people in God's name. God's going to take care of that. And then, many stories of Jesus' mercy and forgiveness, even when the law said to kill people, like the woman caught in adultery. And Jesus says, let the one among you who is without sin be the first to cast the stone. So that's kind of the divine law basis for church teaching. We could go into more, but that's a good foundation for it. All right, so the natural law basis for church teaching, again, not appealing to scripture or church teaching, is this idea of rights. Remember, rights are based on natural law theory. John Locke, Aristotle, the telos of human behavior and an action. So every human being possesses a right to life, and the idea that the right to life is inalienable. So you'll recognize some of this language because it's in our Declaration of Independence, that it says, we believe that we are each endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Inalienable means it can't be taken away. You don't earn it. You can't lose it. It's just there. It can't be alienated from you. It can't be taken away from you. You just have it. So, and that life is the first and highest right, and all other rights are derived from it. So this makes sense, right? More fundamental in America than the right to bear arms is the right to life. You can't use your right to bear arms to take someone else's life. More fundamental than the right to free speech, which is a great right, is the right to life of other people. You can't go into a theater and just yell fire, or you can't slander someone, or things like that. There's limits on those, and life comes first, right? Free speech is great, but if you're dead, it doesn't do you much good. So life is the primary right, and it's the right on which all other rights are built. So if the right to life comes into conflict with another right, the right to life takes precedence. So the right to freedom of religion. So let's say there's a religion that practices human sacrifice. Yes, you have a right to freedom of religion, but it doesn't trump the right to life. Right to life trumps the right freedom of religion. Right to freedom of inquiry, meaning like scientific discoveries. Just because, yes, we have the freedom to pursue things, but not at the cost of someone's life, like cloning. The problem with cloning, we'll get into a little bit more in this unit, is that to make one healthy clone, you generally have to have a lot of dead clones to get there. So anyway, we're cloning humans, lots of ethical issues there. The right to control one's own body, and this is the foundation of the pro-choice pro-life debate, is pro-choice people will say, well, it's the woman's right to do what she wants with her body, but the right to do what you want with your body doesn't trump someone else's right to life. Right? I have a right to do what I want with my body. It doesn't mean I can shoot someone, punch someone, etc. Because their right to life comes first before my right to do what I want with my body. So, all right. So the right to life is primary. It trumps all other rights. So other people do not have the right to take our life from us. So this is a good point, is that when we're talking about the right to life, more, if you're going to be technical about it, what it means is it's the right not to be killed. Right? You don't have a right to not die. Right? If I get coronavirus or whatever and die, nobody's violated my rights. Right? If I get in a car crash and I run into a tree, nobody's violated my rights. I just died. Right? But if someone's human actions are they're culpable actions, meaning there's something they're responsible for, meaning either they freely chose it or even if it was accidental, they should have been responsible enough. If it's their culpable action, if something they're responsible for takes my life, I have a right to not have that happen to me Okay, that's what we call killing. Killing is when you culpably end someone's life, meaning it's your responsibility. And so the right to life, more precisely, is called the right not to be killed, which will come in it'd be very important next unit. We talk about peace and war. So from the Declaration of Independence, here's the quote. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So you've probably studied that in history class before. I think we've read it in this class too. So in Catholic teaching, there's this idea, now that we've covered the divine law and the natural law basis of this idea of the right to life, there's something in Catholic teaching called the consistent ethic of life, meaning you can't just apply this to one issue, you got to apply it across the board. And this, if you've ever read my article that I wrote on when I tell you I'm pro-life, this is what I mean. This is very much in line with that. It means that you're going to value human life in every area, not just in the area that matches up with like your political beliefs on the left or on the right or whatever, but in every area. So the church supports things that promotes peace initiatives and promoting reconciliation. So the church has been very involved, especially after World War I and World War II, with like the peace treaties that were set up. Most wars and violent activity, the church will come out and denounce and try to get involved in that. We did a whole unit on justice. We talked about that. Care for the environment. Church is very big on that. Care for refugees and immigrants. Church is huge in that area. Family life. Church is huge in promoting that. And developing community. So all of these things are part of being pro-life. And the church opposes things that threaten human life and its flourishing. So embryonic stem cell research, that's when you take like human embryos, very, very young humans, like just a few days old, and their cells are called stem cells, and they can grow into all sorts of different types of cells. And lots of scientists think, oh, we could use those cells to like treat cancer and all sorts of things, but you got to kill the embryo to do it. So you can't kill one person to save another. Intentionally. So human cloning, we talked about before. You get one healthy clone, you're going to kill a bunch of clones. Abortion, right? Just, you can't just kill someone because, if you created someone, you can't just kill them because you don't want them or they're in the way or they're sick or even to some extent if they're going to inconvenience you or you're not able to raise them. Euthanasia, that's assisted suicide, so you can't even kill yourself. Capital punishment, you can't kill a criminal for doing something. And we'll talk about that a little bit this unit, but basically, unless there's no other way to keep other people safe. But in our society, we have maximum security prisons and that sort of thing. So unjust war, which we'll talk about more next unit. Poverty, environmental destruction, social ills like gun violence, the drug epidemic, and all sorts of injustice. So you'll see some of these are more like direct killing, and some of these are more just kind of like things that degrade people's quality of life. But all of these are part of the consistent ethic of life and add up to what is often called the culture of life versus the culture of death. So the church wants to build a culture of life, but John Paul II, who coined this term, I think, the culture of death, is basically saying that there's kind of this battle going on in the modern world between a culture of life, which supports life, and a culture of death, which sees human life as kind of a commodity to be used, and if it's not useful, it can be thrown away. So embryonic stem cell research, what's the implicit cultural message there is that some humans are more useful dead than alive. These small embryonic humans who may be frozen in an embryo bank because they weren't used for in vitro fertilization, they're not really useful for anything. So why don't we, do research on them and harvest them so we can cure other people because they're not really useful. That's the implicit culture of death message. Abortion, your life isn't worthwhile if it wasn't planned, if you're gonna be poor, if you're gonna have suffering, if you're gonna be sick, if it's gonna inconvenience others, or maybe even threaten others in some way. Euthanasia, the culture of death message there subliminally is that your life isn't worth living if it's painful or expensive to keep you alive, and that suffering can like trump the value of your life or the dignity of your life. And then lastly, capital punishment. The implicit message there from the culture of death is that your life can lose its value. If you do something bad, then your life is no longer valuable. You've lost your dignity and that sort of thing. And so these practices contribute to this culture of death. Pope Francis calls it the throwaway culture because they undermine this notion that all human life is sacred, kind of that it's disposable. It's for a purpose, and once it can't serve that purpose, it can, or if it can't serve that purpose, it can just be thrown away. And that each of those above practices is a grave sin because it says that your life is only valuable if X, Y, Z. So a couple examples I have done here in my personal notes. Um, so basically, remember back in Unit 6, we talked a lot about that idea of structural injustice. So we talked about like sweatshops. So like you and I might not be evil people, but still most of our clothes are probably made by like slave sweatshops in a lot of ways. And that's really hard to combat because it's built into, it's like structural sin. It's social sin. Imagine if you were a cotton farmer in Alabama back in the 1820s, assuming you were white. Um, and you really felt bad about slavery, but it's like, how do you compete in that market, right? So it's that culture of death, those structural societal sins make it really hard, even for really good people, to be good. It makes it really easy to be bad. And so it's a similar idea there. So think of our current economy built on fossil fuels. Like it's really hard for us to take care of the environment because we live in this culture where we consume a lot, we use a lot of water, we use a lot of food, we pollute a lot. I mean, how do you get around? You get around in cars. Most of our electricity comes from like coal and fossil fuels and stuff like that. It's really hard to live green, even though probably you and I want to. That's part of this culture of death, this structural sin. If a woman gets pregnant and she doesn't have access to housing or childcare, maternity leave, it's really hard for her to not choose abortion. Or we live in a society where it's not cool to be an unwed mother, and there's no support for you. It's really, even if that woman really, really wants to do the right thing, it's really hard for her to make that choice. So that's part of the culture of death. If you go to college, if a girl goes to college and she gets pregnant, and she's not allowed to live in the dorms while she's pregnant, which is a lot of colleges have those sorts of rules, then it makes it hard for her to choose the right thing because not only is she going to have to raise this baby, but now she doesn't have somewhere to live. And she doesn't have childcare because there's probably not childcare on campus. So there's all sorts of things like that are part of the culture of death, this throwaway culture. And so and we'll talk about this more when we talk about euthanasia and assisted suicide. And people it's almost passed in Maryland a couple of times, and it's passed in a number of different states, the idea that, if you're sick or terminally ill, and it's a number of European countries have this as well. I think Canada does too, that you can have physician assisted suicide. People say, oh, I have a right to choose to die, and that's how I maintain my death with dignity. And again, we'll study that later in the unit. But imagine if that became the norm. I remember my grandmother, when towards the end of her life, she lived alone. Her husband had died years before, and she always felt like a burden to us. When she invited her over, I'd go over to help her with stuff. She'd always just say, oh, I don't want to seem like a burden. I don't want to seem like a burden. And we'd always say, no, Grandma, you're not a burden. Or, we love you. We love being around you. She always felt that way. Imagine if it was legal for her to kill herself, and then imagine she got a disease, and all of her friends, when they got a disease like Alzheimer's or something, chose death with dignity or whatever. Like, not all of a sudden it goes from a choice to die to now it's an obligation to die. Kind of like it is with when a teenage girl gets pregnant. Okay, so in some ways you could say, yes, she has a choice to have an abortion, but in some ways it almost feels like a cultural obligation to have an abortion. There's that pressure that if she doesn't, if she has an abortion, nobody knows. But if she doesn't have the abortion, then everybody knows, and everybody's like, oh, she's that teenage pregnant girl, right? And so it's not just a choice, it's an obligation almost in some ways by our culture. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a culture of death. And that's why the church fights things like euthanasia so hard, is because we don't want that to happen to our grandparents or us when we're older, when we get to that point. And there's like this pressure on us that like, well, you're burning on your family now. You're not, now your medical bills are stacking up. Now you're not pulling your weight like you used to. Really, I mean, is your life really worth living anymore? Oh, now you've got a disease and you're probably going to suffer. Like, it's probably just better to, like there's that societal pressure that builds. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about the throwaway culture, the culture of death. This idea that just kind of seeps into our mentality that if your life is X or if your life lacks Y, then it's not really worth living, and it's okay for you to kill you or to not take care of you. So that's the culture of death that the church is trying so hard to fight. So let's say, so the other example with that euthanasia is, just like I said, on college campuses now, there's no childcare or place for women who are pregnant to live. Imagine in the future if there were no assisted livings for elderly people, or there were no homes for people with Alzheimer's. This has happened with kids with Down syndrome. There's almost hardly any people with Down syndrome anymore because now there's prenatal testing when you get pregnant. When my wife and I have gone through this when we've had our children. We go to the doctor at one of the appointments. They say, "Oh, do you want to test?" Like it's just kind of assumed. Oh, you're going to test for Down syndrome. You're going to test for trisomy 21. There's a number of tests they want to do. My wife and I have just said we're not going to do those tests. And they're like, "Really? Why?" I was like, "Because it doesn't matter to us." But a lot of people get those tests. So when it comes back, oh, you're having a Down syndrome child, like over 90% of parents will abort. And so now there's fewer services for people with Down syndrome. So now the people that do have a Down syndrome baby and wouldn't have chosen abortion for that baby beforehand, now it's even harder for them to not choose abortion because there's fewer services for Down syndrome kids because there's fewer Down syndrome kids. So again, that's what we're fighting when we're fighting the culture of death. So, in summary, God dwells within every human being. Therefore, every human life deserves to be loved, supported, and protected. Christians have an obligation to protect human life and promote its well-being on both an individual basis and on the societal level. That connects back to the 2 feet of social justice that we talked about in Unit 6. Remember, it's individual charity, but also structural change, and that's how you move forward. It's both. You need both justice and charity, both individual and on the societal level. One of the things you'll notice that I'm trying to do through these units is weave them together and show that it doesn't fit with like the way American politics normally does. Yes, a lot of these are political issues, but we're not taking a political approach to it. Okay. If you say social justice, who cares about that? You'd say people on the left, Democrats, liberals. You say who cares about respect for human life? You'd say conservatives, Republicans, people on the right. But really, there's some of those issues on both sides, and really, they're two sides of the same coin. They're the same thing. Social justice is reverence for human life. They are the same thing, just kind of looking at them through the different lens. They're the exact same thing. So anyway, just kind of keep that in mind as we go forward. This isn't a left-right thing, and it doesn't fit well into political categories. So just like Jesus. So that's all I got for you. Respect life, people.